After I told her to turn off her floodlights, my neighbor falsely reported me for growing weed. The DEA busted my home and left $18,000 in damage. She whispered, "Next time don't snitch." So I planted a tip that got her husband's shed raided. I was eating leftover lasagna on my couch when the front door exploded. I didn't even have time to drop my fork before a dozen men in black tactical gear stormed in, shouting, "DEA. Hands up!" One of them slammed me to the ground so hard my chin hit the tile. I tasted blood. My dog, Buddy, was barking from the hallway, losing his mind. They tore through my place like it was a drug den. Cabinets ripped open. Drywall smashed. They even drilled into the concrete in my basement floor. By the time they were done, the house looked like it had been hit by a hurricane. No weed, no grow lights, nothing. Just me, a 38-year-old mechanic with a busted front door and a terrified golden retriever. They handed me a search warrant, mumbled something about credible neighborhood tip, and left. $18,000 in damage, according to the adjuster. Except the insurance wouldn't cover it because it was government action. That night, I sat on my porch staring at the wreckage when my neighbor, Kathy, walked past with her yappy little dog. She smirked. "Rough night," she said, like she'd just seen a car crash. I didn't answer. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "Next time don't snitch." My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what she meant. 2 weeks earlier, I'd asked her politely to turn off the blinding LED floodlights she'd installed that lit up my entire living room all night long. She said she'd think about it. Instead, she left them on every night. So I reported it to the HOA after 3 sleepless weeks. She got a written warning and a fine. I thought that was the end of it. Apparently not. For days after the raid, I couldn't even look at her house without my blood boiling. I called the DEA, tried to get the agent's name, but they just said they couldn't disclose the tip source. My lawyer said I'd have to sue the government, which would take years. I tried to move on. But every time I looked at those damn lights, I saw red. And then one evening, when I was mowing my lawn, I saw something, a small shed behind her fence that I'd never noticed before. I heard noises from inside, like humming equipment. When she saw me looking, she rushed out and closed the door fast. That's when the first thought hit me, the kind that changes everything. If Kathy could make a call and ruin my life with a lie, maybe I could return the favor. But what I found in that shed wasn't just petty, it was criminal. And when I realized what her husband was really doing in there, I knew exactly how to make her regret every second of what she'd done to me. I didn't even have to lie. I grew up in Cincinnati, not far from where I live now, so I know what neighborhoods look like when people actually care for them. Kids on bikes, porches with plants, front lawns that don't look like battlefields. I'm 38, single, work full-time as an auto mechanic at a shop off Coleraine Avenue. I fix other people's problems for a living, and I like that. It's honest, greasy, tiring work that pays the bills and leaves my hands sore in a way that feels real. My house is a small 2-story row house I bought when my wife, I used to be married, left me 3 years ago. Divorce was messy but quiet. We split the furniture and the dog. Buddy came with me. He's old now, silver muzzle and all, but he's the only thing that keeps the nights from getting too lonely. I like the neighborhood because it's still got the kind of people who borrow a cup of sugar and return it with a cupcake. Usually. Kathy moved in 2 years ago with her husband, Mark. They were new to the area, upper 30s, kid-free, always impeccably dressed. At first, we had the usual neighborly small talk. "How long you been here?" "Nice lawn." She smiled a lot like she was practicing. Mark kept to himself, drove a beat-up pickup, said hey from across the driveway. They put up those fake rustic planters and an American flag that looked like it had been ironed. We had one argument in the first year about the mailbox. Hers kept getting bent because some delivery truck clipped it, and she got the HOA involved until they fined the driver's company. I thought that was petty. She never forgave it. That should have been the clue that she kept score. The floodlights started last winter. Massive, industrial things fixed to the eaves that made my living room look like a stage. I work nights sometimes, sleep in the morning, and the lights killed whatever sleep I had left. I knocked on their door twice. She opened, coffee in hand, and said the lights were for safety. Fair enough, I said. I left it alone for a week. Then another. I watched movies with the blinds closed, felt the glare through the curtains like someone shining a spotlight in my face. Buddy got jumpy. I got snappy. I reported it to the HOA after 3 weeks of sleepwalking through afternoons. It felt bureaucratic and small, a form, an email, a notice in their file. They gave her a warning and a small fine. I thought that would be the end of it. For me, it was a practical thing. For her, apparently, it turned into a vendetta. There's more. Mark worked nights too, or so I assumed. He would go out after dark, his truck lights a sliver down the street. He kept to the shed behind their house, I'd see the curtains twitch. They had a routine, the kind of quiet rhythm you only notice when it's broken. I never once suspected anything illegal. Who does? Not me. I fix cars, not crime. Before the raid, my life had a rhythm. Work, fix Buddy's arthritis with supplements, mow the lawn, drink too much black coffee, complain to myself about the city. I didn't look for fireworks. I didn't want drama. I wanted peace and a paycheck that covered my mortgage. I didn't have enemies, I had inconveniences. That's why the raid ripped everything open. It wasn't just the damage or the fear. It was the knowledge that someone in my neighborhood could choose to ruin me and do it with the quiet satisfaction of a person checking off a box. It felt personal the way a shove in the back feels personal. After the raid, I started paying attention in a different way. Small things that used to be background noise began to stand out. The way Mark would lock his shed at weird hours, the hum of something inside late at night, the hurried way Kathy would close blinds when I walked by. It wasn't proof, it was curiosity, and curiosity is a dangerous thing when you've already been burned. After the raid, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house made me tense up. Buddy barked at nothing. I kept replaying that moment, Kathy leaning in, whispering, "Next time don't snitch." It looped in my head like a bad song. I didn't even realize how angry I'd become until I caught myself gripping the steering wheel too hard on my way to work. The shop guys joked about DEA Dan, but I couldn't laugh. They didn't see my walls cracked open, the holes drilled into my basement floor. They didn't get the way it feels when someone turns your home into a crime scene. About 2 weeks after the raid, I started noticing Mark again. He'd always been quiet, but now he was paranoid quiet. He'd park his truck backward in the driveway so the plates weren't visible from the street. Sometimes he'd go out to the shed at 11 p.m. and stay there until dawn. One night, when I was walking Buddy, I heard this low electric buzzing from inside, like generators or pumps, and smelled something sharp and chemical. I'd seen enough weird car work to know that wasn't a normal hobby. I started documenting things, dates, times, sounds, how long he stayed in there. I wasn't even sure why at first, part paranoia, part instinct, but something in me wanted the truth. Then one night, a delivery truck pulled up to their driveway around midnight. No logos, just a white van with tinted windows. Two guys got out and unloaded these heavy black bins into the shed. Kathy stood outside, watching. When I caught her eye from my yard, she didn't even flinch. She just smiled this tight little smile, like she was daring me to ask. The next morning, Mark was out back burning cardboard boxes in a metal drum. The air smelled like melted plastic. Something was definitely off. I debated calling the police, but what was I going to say? Hey, the neighbors who got me raided might be doing something sketchy in their shed. They'd laugh me off as the paranoid guy with a grudge. I didn't need more cops at my door, so I went old school. I waited until they both left one Saturday afternoon. I hopped my back fence, crawled through the hedge, and crept up to the shed. The door had a padlock, but the wood frame was cheap. I could see through a crack near the bottom. Inside, it looked like a full-on operation. Shelves lined with gallon jugs of chemicals. Large tubs, plastic tubing, bags of fertilizer, and stacks of cardboard boxes labeled with names I didn't recognize. There was also what looked like a ventilation setup that ran into the ground. Whatever it wasn't just gardening. I didn't touch anything, just took pictures through the gap. My hands were shaking. I was halfway back over the fence when I heard Kathy's voice. "Enjoying the view, Dan." She was standing there, holding a grocery bag, watching me like she'd been expecting it. I froze. She set the bag down, walked closer. "You don't learn, do you?" she said quietly. "Maybe you need another visit from your friends at the DEA." Then she smiled and walked inside. That was the moment I stopped wanting justice. I wanted payback. Because if Kathy was willing to ruin my life with a fake drug tip, and her husband was actually running something illegal right behind their fence, then I finally had leverage. Real leverage. And when I found out exactly what kind of business Mark was running in that shed, I realized I didn't just have a chance for revenge, I had a chance to destroy them completely. I thought I knew what I'd find in that shed: fertilizer, fans, grow lights. I was ready to call the DEA, ready to watch them tear that house apart the same way they tore mine. I imagined cameras, arresting officers, a smug look on Kathy's face. I wanted her to taste panic for once. What I found was worse. I went back a week after my fence hop, but this time I came prepared. Late at night, I sat in my truck across the street with a flashlight and my phone, waiting until the house went dark. When Mark slipped out to the shed, I followed him slow and quiet, the way you follow a drunk down an alley. He locked the shed behind him with the same cheap padlock, and I slipped in through the side gate. Inside was a clean, clinical mess. Not the messy, humid jungle of a grow operation. Everything was organized into stations. Stainless steel tables, heat-sealed bags in neat stacks, a digital scale that looked like it belonged in a lab. There were little blister packs like the kind pills come in, and rows of unmarked white tablets in trays. The smell was chemical but sweet, not like weed. I pinched my nose. On the wall, taped with military precision, was a grid of manila envelopes labeled with names and dates. Next to them sat a spiral notebook filled with addresses and amounts, not personal notes, ledger entries. The ledger had phone numbers and pickup times. It was a distribution map. The kind of thing that lands people in federal court. My stomach went cold. This wasn't marijuana. This was pills, maybe fentanyl, maybe something else. Whatever it wasn't a hobby. It was a business built to make people disappear. I took pictures through the gap in the door, hands shaking. I felt like I was evidence gathering for a stranger's life. That's when I saw something that turned the blood in my veins to ice. Pinned to the wall, under a photograph of Mark's old pickup, was a folded piece of paper with my name on it, my full name, my address, and a date. 2 weeks before the raid, someone had handwritten the words, "Tip Growth Operation. Check basement." Under it, in the same sharp handwriting, an address different from mine, circled and labeled, Kathy's HOA complaint filed 1005. There was a phone number with call times annotated next to it. At first I thought it was a mistake, then I flipped through the ledger. There were more notes, names circled, crosses through other names, little check marks next to one's labeled agent. I'd assumed Kathy had filed a petty HOA complaint out of spite. I'd assumed she'd called in a favor. I hadn't imagined that she kept a ledger, that she tracked movements, that she used other people like pawns. I sat on the edge of an upturned crate and felt the room tilt. If Kathy had a list, if she'd been monitoring and deciding who to tip, and when, then my raid wasn't a one-off. It was a maneuver. She had leverage and she used it. She'd filed that HOA complaint like a soft warning, then sent a harder one when she needed to make an example. She hadn't whispered, "Next time don't snitch," as a casual taunt. It was a threat backed by practice. I backed away slowly, the hairs on my arms prickling. The whole thing was colder than I'd imagined. This wasn't just petty vindictiveness. This was a coordinated method: gather intelligence, pick targets, and remove them when necessary. Whoever she was working with, she had access. On my way out, I grabbed the folded paper with my name on it. It felt like holding a confession. The realization settled in like a brick. She hadn't called the DEA to get even, she'd called them when it fit her plan. And she'd been playing both sides. I walked home with the paper in my pocket and Buddy's eyes on me like he knew something had shifted. I sat at my kitchen table and spread out the photos. The ledger, the envelopes. The proof stared back at me. I'd thought the obvious retaliation was to tip the DEA about the shed. But if Kathy had agent contacts, if she could weaponize tips and manipulate investigations, turning this over to the same people who destroyed my life might just make her disappear, or worse, make her hands cleaner. So I started thinking about another kind of tip. One that couldn't be traced. One that would cut deeper than a raid. One that would expose not just a shed, but the way she'd been using law and people like tools. I'm not a mastermind. I'm a guy who can change an alternator and bleed a radiator. And for the first time in my life, I found myself building something that felt like a plan. Not because I wanted to be clever, because rage keeps a person tidy. Every torn sheet of drywall, every cracked plaster line across my basement lived in my mouth like grit. I could call a lawyer and bleed money into an eventual lawsuit. I could call the DEA and hope they'd care that their own raid had been baited. Those felt like letting someone else decide how this ended. So I started with the least romantic thing, sorting evidence. Not how a criminal sorts it, how a man who's been wronged organizes facts so other people can't ignore them. I spread the photos on my kitchen table, the picture of my own house with the drywall gash beside the shot of the ledger with my name. I taped the folded paper with my name to the inside of the ledger photo, so whenever I looked down, the connection was there. Her handwriting, their operation, my ruined house. I made copies. There's power in paper that can't be swiped off a phone. I put sets in envelopes and marked them with nothing but dates. I labeled one pile HOA and another local reporter, because revenge had to feel like truth getting air, not just me trying to push my buttons for kicks. I wasn't interested in watching them squirm in secret. I wanted the glare. People who operate in plain sight rely on that quiet. I wanted it gone. I thought about the cops. For a second, I almost laughed at how naive that sounded, until I remembered the DEA agent's blank eyes and the way he refused to hand me a name. There are different kinds of law enforcement. Federal agents move on tips and vanish. Local authorities answer to voters and paper trails. If you want to get a neighborhood's attention, you go local first. You go where your complaint has to be logged and where denial has to be explained to an actual person. I wrote a draft complaint anyway. Short, clean, no venom, just the facts. Odd deliveries at night, chemical smells, ledger with distribution notes, my name pinned in their files. I didn't include how I'd gotten the photos. I didn't need to, but sticking the ledger to a sheriff's desk felt too neat. I was more afraid of being dismissed than of being righteous. So I made another pile, the one that felt like a real hit, a reporter. Small-town newsrooms still exist. They love a corruption thread that ties community safety to hypocrisy. A story where the woman who tattled on a petty HOA violation turns out to be running a distribution network. That would be a headline that didn't let people ignore it. It would force the HOA, the police, the neighbors, everyone to look. I rehearsed what I'd say to the reporter in my head, kept it factual, kept my voice steady. I'd hand over copies, the ledger picture with my name circled, and ask them to follow the paper. Not to send a SWAT team in, not to catch anyone in the act, but to investigate. Let the light do the work. Let the community's eyes be the jury. There was another part of the plan I didn't tell myself out loud at first. Revenge is sometimes about timing. If you hit too fast, you look spiteful. If you wait too long, you risk losing the moment. So I cataloged dates, noting when deliveries happened, when the shed hummed, when Kathy walked past with that smug little smile. I marked one of those dates with a thicker pen and felt my jaw clench. That night, when they were out, I sat on my porch and watched their house like a man waiting for a train he'd planned to derail. I knew, too, that there was a moral weight to what I was about to do. I hadn't found weapons in that shed. I'd found records, ledgers, pills, things that ruin people's lives in ways that stay quiet and secret. I didn't want to create more harm. I wanted exposure. I wanted the ledger to speak louder than revenge. I wanted them stripped of their armor, the whispers, the privileges, the smug immunity. When dawn came, I'd decided on a sequence. Copies to a reporter, a clean complaint to county law enforcement, and one envelope slipped anonymously to the HOA president with a photo of the ledger and a note that said, simply, "You were warned." That last part felt petty and necessary. A small, civil jab to remind them they'd already helped her play the system. I slept badly that night, but I slept with a plan, which felt, strangely, like control. The next morning, Buddy nudged my hand, and I walked to my mailbox with the envelopes in my jacket. Halfway down the block, I stopped. My finger tightened on an envelope. I heard a car door slam across the street. Kathy stood in her driveway, phone to her ear, eyes scanning our side of the street the way a hawk watches sparrows. For a second, she looked straight at me, lips thin, not smiling. Then she lowered the phone and mouthed something I couldn't catch. I had a plan. She had nerves. Neither of us knew who moved next. I thought I had momentum. Copies in envelopes. A reporter I'd convinced to meet at a diner. A clean complaint ready to file with the county. I felt like a man taking his life back in small, surgical cuts. Then everything started snapping back at me like a trap. The reporter I met, a wiry woman named Jenna who smelled like cigarette smoke and old coffee, listened to my whole story without blinking. She asked for copies of the ledger photos and the folded note with my name. I handed them over and told her why I thought the HOA needed to know and why the county should take a look. She leaned back, tapped her fingers, and said, "This is good, ugly, but there's something you need to know before we run anything." The breath left me. "What?" She told me a short version first. The newsroom had been burned before. They'd run a neighborhood hypocrisy piece 2 years earlier, and a local business owner sued for defamation, cost the paper half its budget. I nodded like I understood. Then she dropped the shard. "Your name's not the only one on that paper," she said. "And some of the names, they're connected." "Connected to what?" I asked. "Publishers, county officials, an editor who sits on our paper's advisory board." She flicked a cigarette ash into the ashtray like punctuation. "If this ledger ties the councilman's wife to shipments and names a donor to the paper, my editor gets a call. They don't like calls like that." My chest tightened. I'd expected resistance, but not this. I thought the press would be a blunt instrument, loud, ugly, and public. Instead, it was delicate and tied into the same web that defended Kathy. The more I pushed, the more I realized how many people had hands in the shawl she'd woven. Then the next thing happened, the thing that really peeled me open. A small white envelope slid under my door that night. No return address. Inside, a single 4x6 photo. It was taken from the angle of the shed's small window. A photo of me, mid-climb over their fence, phone in hand, face lit by the glow of the shed's interior. The back of the photo had a message in that same neat handwriting I'd seen on the ledger. "Curious men get hurt, stop." My first reaction was fury. My second reaction was something colder, realization. They hadn't been passive actors, they'd been watching me. They'd predicted how I'd react and kept a camera in the shed to record me. In their ledger, next to my name, there was a small checkbox that I somehow hadn't noticed before. Checked off. Target engaged. I tried the sheriff's office the next morning, the number I'd dialed before and been brushed off with bureaucratic politeness. This time, the deputy I spoke to was more patient, and when I told him what I had, his voice went flat. "We're aware of a confidential informant connected to a federal task force," he said carefully. He wouldn't elaborate. He suggested I stop poking around and let them handle it. Let them handle it. The phrase tasted like rust in my mouth. If Kathy was an informant, if she'd been feeding information to federal agents, arranging small raids to curry favor, and using the protection of that confidential status to shield a much bigger business. My envelopes to the paper, my complaint to the county, the DEA raid that ruined my life, all of it suddenly looked like chess moves on her board. I'd been playing checkers. That night, I sat on the edge of my ruined couch and watched Buddy's slow breaths. The photo sat on the coffee table like a verdict. Whoever they were tied to, DEA, county, press, donors, could make serious trouble for anyone who stuck their head up. My plan had morphed into something fragile and dangerous. I imagined Kathy folding up my life like paper and tucking it away. I thought about burning the photos, about quitting while I could. I thought about the ledger again, the names, the check marks, the way my own name had been circled like bait. But the weirdest thing I felt right then wasn't fear. It was a new kind of focus. If they could anticipate me, maybe I could anticipate them. If they used the law like a shield, maybe I could use the truth like an axe. Except now the truth wasn't a thing in my hands. It belonged to a ledger that connected too many clean people to too much filth. And whatever I did next would have to cut through not just the two of them, Cassie and Mark, but the entire network that let them get away with it. I was out of petty options. I had to know why they were untouchable. And when I finally learned the real reason, the cruel, bone-deep one, I'd understand how deeply I'd been wronged. It took me a week to learn the truth, and when I did, it didn't come from the cops, or the reporter, or even Kathy herself. It came from a man named Sam, one of the delivery drivers I'd seen dropping those black bins at the shed. He showed up at the shop one afternoon, eyes darting like he was being watched, said he needed an oil change, but when I asked what car he drove, he shook his head and whispered, "You're the guy they raided, right?" My stomach went tight. He told me he didn't have long, said the shed operation wasn't what I thought it was, that it wasn't even Mark's idea. Kathy ran it. She handled distribution, communication, and the ledger. Mark was just the face, the errand boy, the one who took the risk if things went south. She was the brains. The paper trail stopped with him, not her. And the reason she could do it, Sam said, was because Kathy was a federal informant. She'd made a deal 3 years ago after getting caught moving opioids through a clinic she worked for in Kentucky. In exchange for avoiding prison, she agreed to become a confidential tip source for the DEA, a CI, as Sam called it. Her job was to give names, locations, and credible drug activity leads. The more results her tips produced, the more her handlers rewarded her. That's when it all snapped into focus. The raids, the credible neighborhood tip, the immunity, the smug look on her face when the DEA left my house in ruins. She'd used me again. She needed fresh, easy targets to maintain her informant value. So she'd turn in harmless people, fake small-time operations, make herself look like she was helping clean up the neighborhood. The feds didn't care about collateral damage. They cared about metrics, results. So she created them. That's why my name was on the wall. I wasn't a threat. I was a number she needed to stay safe. Sam said she'd done it before, 2 other people in the last couple of years. A landscaper who accidentally had his shed raided. A renter who got flagged for suspected meth supplies. Both were innocent. Both left the neighborhood quietly after. Neither ever filed a complaint. Kathy's handlers saw her as a success story, a local source who kept turning up productive tips. They didn't realize she was running her own side business out of her husband's shed, using the immunity her cooperation gave her as cover to move actual drugs. She tipped off fake targets to hide her real shipments. It was perfect, untraceable, and cruel in a way that was almost artistic. Sam said Mark had tried to pull out of it 6 months ago. He couldn't stand the stress, the late-night runs, the constant fear. Kathy didn't let him. He was scared of her, Sam said. He told me once if he ever left, she'd make sure he went down for everything. I asked why Sam was telling me this. He looked at me with the kind of fear that makes a man look older than he is. Because she's going to set you up again, he said. Word is, she told her contact you've been snooping. They're going to find something next time. I drove home in silence that night. Every light in my house looked foreign. Every noise felt dangerous. Buddy barked at the window, but I didn't look out. I sat in the dark, gripping the photo she'd slid under my door, and I realized something bone-deep. Kathy didn't just ruin people's lives out of spite. She did it for survival. It wasn't personal, it was business. She'd weaponized the justice system, turning neighbors into camouflage. I'd thought revenge would be simple, tell the truth, expose her, watch it burn. But this wasn't a grudge anymore. This was about dismantling someone who'd built a fortress out of corruption. And I wasn't going to call the cops. I wasn't going to send another letter. If Kathy used her immunity to protect her business, then I was going to make sure that immunity became the very thing that destroyed her. Because I had proof. I had names. And I knew exactly where to send them to the people who watched her. I didn't picture myself as the avenging type. I pictured a lot of things that night. The drywall dust like gray snow, Buddy's paws on my lap, the tiny smirk on Kathy's face, but not some cinematic takedown. I wanted normal, my door fixed, my basement patched, an apology that would never come. What I got instead was a plan that didn't look like revenge at first glance. It looked like paperwork. First, I played the long game. I mailed copies of the ledger photos and the folded paper with my name, the thing that proved Kathy used the system, to 3 places that could not be casually shrugged off. A state-level narcotics task force hotline in Columbus, the county prosecutor's public integrity unit, and the city's largest investigative reporter with a reputation for not backing down. Each envelope was anonymous, plain, and sterile. No threats, no melodrama, just facts laid out like bones. Then I did something small and petty on purpose. I took a stack of HOA violation notices they'd gotten over the years and slipped them into the mailbox of the HOA president with a note that said, "You collected." It was a tiny ceremonial jab, nothing more, but watching the president's face when the board called a special meeting felt like a small public accounting. The story landed where I needed it to. The investigative reporter, Jenna, the cigarette woman, called me 3 days later. She had more than curiosity, she had teeth. She'd started asking questions that made people in suits sweat. The county prosecutor opened a file. The state task force made a discreet inquiry. The local sheriff who'd once told me to stop poking now asked to meet, and he didn't bring the bored tone he used before. He brought a folder and a promise to take my proof seriously. Kathy didn't panic right away. She kept her smile like a shield and doubled down on civility at neighborhood functions. Mark started showing up late for work more and more. He looked smaller. Then one morning, a couple of unmarked cars rolled up to their house. I watched from my living room, heart thudding, as two men in plain clothes walked to the shed and looked inside. They didn't smash anything. They didn't make a show. They took photos and left. A few hours later, a sheriff's deputy dropped by my door and asked me to come down to the station. Under oath, I told everything: the raid, the ledger, the photo slid under my door, Sam's whisper about Kathy being an informant. It felt raw and clean to say it out loud. I watched the deputy's face when I handed over the ledger photo with my name circled. It was the same face I'd been trying to manufacture for months with envelopes and calls, the face of someone forced to look. Within weeks, the veneer started to crack. The prosecutor issued subpoenas. The sheriff confronted the HOA about its ties. Jenna ran a piece, careful and granular, that laid out how an informant's immunity had been exploited. The headlines weren't theatrical, but they were relentless. Neighbors I'd never heard from called my house. People who had been quiet began asking questions in public forums. The small town of Cincinnati blocks I knew shifted like tectonic plates. Kathy tried to play the victim, the neighborhood busybody targeted by a disgruntled man. Her handlers at the DEA were awkward and defensive. Their confidential source became a liability they had to explain away. Mark went quiet and then disappeared for a few days. I watched him one evening pack a duffel into his truck and drive off without looking back. No dramatic courtroom brawl played out in front of my porch. There was a stack of subpoenas, a settlement offer from the DEA's Civil Affairs Group that included a check to pay for my door and the drywall, and then the legal pressure built on the ledger and the witnesses, a criminal referral. Kathy's immunity was examined and ultimately limited. It didn't save her from charges once prosecutors connected her ledger to real distribution. Mark pleaded guilty to lesser counts. When the check came, it didn't fix the nights. It didn't erase the memory of hands in my home or the way Buddy hid under the table for a week after the raid. But it did buy a new door and half a drywall crew. More than that, it forced a public accounting. The whisper she'd used as a weapon became the reason people looked at their own systems harder. At the neighborhood picnic the following summer, Kathy watched me from under the bleacher tent like she'd been taught to watch. I walked past with Buddy on a leash, son on my shoulders, and she opened her mouth like she might say something. I tipped my head, gave her a small, almost apologetic smile and said, "Hard to sleep with floodlights on, huh?" She didn't snarl. She didn't whisper. She looked away. Revenge, I learned, wasn't about ruining someone in the exact image they'd ruined you. It was about making the world that let them hide uncomfortable enough that they couldn't pretend it was working anymore. I got my door fixed, my basement patched, and Buddy finally slept through the night. And when people asked how it felt, I'd tell them the same thing: messy, expensive, necessary, and strangely clean. Then I went back to the shop and tightened a stubborn alternator, because some things are simpler fixed with a wrench than with all the papers in the world.